The plane hummed steadily as passengers settled into their seats, the atmosphere calm and routine. However, for one family, the journey was anything but smooth. In the middle of the aircraft, seated between his parents, a young boy named Ethan struggled against the overwhelming sensations that surrounded him. The bright cabin lights, the continuous hum of the engines, the murmur of conversations, and the unpredictable movements of the plane all crashed down on him like a tidal wave. Ethan had autism, and the sensory overload of air travel was unbearable at times. His mother, Olivia, was well prepared. She had packed his favorite noise-canceling headphones, his beloved toy train, and a tablet filled with calming visuals. But despite her best efforts, Ethan was still struggling. He tapped his fingers rhythmically on the armrest, rocked slightly in his seat, and let out small, vocal stems, sounds that helped him regulate his emotions. Most passengers around them paid little mind. A few cast occasional glances, but they quickly returned to their books, screens, or conversations. However, the serenity of the cabin was soon disrupted when a flight attendant, a woman with a sharp, no-nonsense demeanor, approached their row. She had noticed Ethan's movements and the occasional sounds he made. To her, they were a disturbance, an inconvenience. She stopped abruptly beside their seats, arms crossed, and her voice cut through the air like a blade. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her tone void of patience. "Can you please keep your child quiet? Other passengers are trying to rest." Olivia felt her heart drop. She had been through this before, people who didn't understand, who saw Ethan's behavior as something disruptive instead of something natural for him. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm, and gave the attendant a patient but firm look. "My son has autism," Olivia explained, keeping her voice steady despite the growing tension in her chest. "He's doing his best to cope with the environment. The noise and movement of the plane can be overwhelming for him." But instead of sympathy or even mild understanding, the flight attendant's expression hardened. She didn't soften at all. If anything, her annoyance grew. "Well, that's not my problem," she snapped. "Everyone on this flight has to follow the same rules. You need to control him." Control him. The words sliced through Olivia like ice. Her pulse quickened as frustration bubbled inside her. She had spent years advocating for Ethan. Years trying to make the world understand that his behaviors weren't misbehavior but methods of self-regulation. And yet, here she was again, facing another person who refused to see past their own inconvenience. Ethan, sensing the rising tension, whimpered and covered his ears, overwhelmed by the harshness in the woman's voice. His small body tensed, his breathing quickened, and his stimming increased. Olivia could feel her son's distress, could see the panic beginning to take over. "Please," Olivia said, her voice quieter now, but firm, "just give us a moment. He'll calm down." The flight attendant scoffed. "You should have prepared better if you knew he couldn't handle this," she said before turning on her heel and striding down the aisle. Olivia sat frozen in disbelief. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for Ethan, rubbing soothing circles on his back, whispering soft reassurances in his ear. She felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her, not just from the flight attendant, but from some of the passengers who had overheard the exchange. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats, pretending not to have noticed, while others exchanged disapproving glances. The sting of their unspoken criticism was almost as painful as the words that had just been hurled at her. Hadn't she done enough? Hadn't she spent every day of Ethan's life preparing, anticipating, and navigating a world that wasn't built for him? And yet, here she was, being made to feel like a failure, as if she hadn't done everything in her power to make this flight as smooth as possible for her son. Ethan whimpered again, shifting in his seat, his small hands still clamped tightly over his ears. The environment was too much for him, and the confrontation had only worsened it. His mother's heart ached as she held him closer, whispering, "It's okay, sweetheart, you're okay." But she wasn't okay. She was furious. How could someone who worked with the public every day, who was responsible for the well-being of passengers, be so callous? How could she dismiss them so easily? As if Ethan was nothing more than a nuisance, an inconvenience to be silenced? The lack of understanding, the sheer ignorance of it all, burned deep in Olivia's chest. She wasn't asking for special treatment. She wasn't demanding that the rules be ignored. All she wanted was understanding, a shred of human decency, and a moment of patience. But instead, she had been met with cruelty, with scorn. Ethan began rocking in his seat again, his small voice rising with distress. Olivia held him tighter, willing herself to push through the emotions raging inside her. She needed to be strong, for him. But she also knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. She would not let her son be treated like this. She would not let this flight attendant's ignorance go unchecked. This was just the beginning. The tension in the cabin had reached its breaking point. The flight attendant's scathing words still lingered in the air like a bitter echo, each syllable slicing deeper into Olivia's heart. She held Ethan close, his small body trembling against hers, his breath coming in short, erratic gasps as he struggled against the weight of the world pressing down on him. The hum of the plane's engines droned on, an ironic contrast to the storm brewing within her. Passengers had turned their attention to them now, some watching with thinly veiled judgment, others exchanging uneasy glances, as if waiting for something, anything, to happen. A mother pleading for understanding, a child drowning in a world too loud, too bright, too chaotic, and a flight attendant, standing tall in her uniform, her arms crossed, her face set in a mask of irritation, still keeping a wary eye on them. Just when Olivia thought she had endured enough, just when she felt like she might break under the weight of their stares. Under the suffocating feeling of being othered, the unexpected happened. The soft chime of the intercom crackled through the speakers, signaling the arrival of someone important. A few passengers turned toward the front of the plane as the cockpit door creaked open. And then, the captain stepped out. The sight of him sent a ripple of confusion through the cabin. Pilots rarely left the cockpit during a flight unless there was an emergency. His presence alone was enough to silence the hushed murmurs, to draw every eye in the cabin toward him. He walked with a quiet authority, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the rows of seats, his gaze eventually settling on Olivia and Ethan. The flight attendants stiffened, their postures straightening, their hands clasping nervously in front of them. The air itself seemed to grow heavier as he took slow, deliberate steps down the aisle, his polished shoes clicking softly against the floor. The rude flight attendant, the one who had humiliated Olivia, who had dismissed Ethan's distress as nothing more than a problem, visibly tensed as the captain approached. Her confidence faltered, her lips pressing into a thin line. Though she said nothing, perhaps she thought he was here to reinforce her authority, to tell Olivia, in his deep, commanding voice, that rules were rules, that her son needed to behave, that her pleading had fallen on deaf ears. But that wasn't why he was here. He stopped just beside Olivia's row, his expression softening slightly as he looked at Ethan. The child had buried his face in his mother's chest, his small fingers clutching onto the fabric of her shirt, seeking any form of comfort he could find. The captain let out a slow breath before turning his gaze to Olivia, and then, finally, to the flight attendant. "I understand there's been an issue here," he said calmly, but there was an edge to his voice, something that made the air crackle with unspoken weight. The flight attendant opened her mouth, perhaps to justify herself, but before she could speak, the captain lifted a hand, a simple, subtle gesture that cut through the tension like a knife. "I think," he continued, turning his gaze back to Olivia, "that it's time we clear something up." Olivia frowned, unsure of what he meant. The entire cabin seemed to be holding its breath. The silence stretched taut, a string pulled so tight it might snap at any second. The captain exhaled, and then, without hesitation, he said the words that changed everything. "You may not realize this, but your family owns this plane." The words hit like a shockwave. For a long, waited moment, no one moved, no one breathed. The flight attendant's face went pale, her confidence shattering in real time as the meaning behind the captain's words sank in. Passengers gasped softly, some turning in their seats to get a better look at Olivia. Whispers rippled through the cabin, disbelief lacing every word. What did he just say? Did he mean, they own the plane? Olivia herself was frozen, her mind scrambling to process what she had just heard. Had he really said? Her heart pounded wildly, her breath catching in her throat. She had known her husband's company had deep investments in aviation, that their business ties ran through some of the biggest airline corporations in the world. But she had never imagined that this plane, this very plane, was under their ownership. And neither had the flight attendant. The moment the realization fully hit her, she took a small, stumbling step back, as if she wished she could vanish into the background, as if she could undo everything she had just done. Her fingers twitched nervously at her sides, her lips parting slightly, but no words came out. There were no words that could fix this. No words that could erase the humiliation she had inflicted upon Olivia and her son. The captain, meanwhile, remained composed, his face betraying no amusement, no sympathy for the woman now drowning in the consequences of her own arrogance. He turned his attention back to Olivia, and though his tone remained professional, there was something in his gaze that spoke of a silent apology. "I am deeply sorry for what you've experienced today," he said. "This is not how any passenger, let alone you, should have been treated." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, passengers now openly staring at the flight attendant, waiting for her to say something. And finally, she spoke. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice shaking. The sharp authority in her tone had vanished, replaced now with an almost desperate attempt to salvage what little dignity she had left. I wouldn't have." But she cut herself off before she could finish, because she knew, deep down, that it didn't matter. It wasn't just about who Olivia was, or what she owned, it was about how she had treated them. And now, there was no undoing it. Olivia, still reeling from the shock, slowly lifted her chin, the weight of everything, the pain, the anger, the exhaustion, boiling into something sharper, something resolute. She looked directly at the flight attendant, her voice steady as she spoke. "You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with kindness." The words landed with an unmistakable finality. The flight attendant's shoulders sagged slightly, the reality of her mistake crashing over her like a tidal wave. The rest of the flight passed in stunned silence. The once arrogant flight attendant kept her distance, her presence barely noticeable as she worked with hesitant, subdued movements. The whispers among passengers never fully died down, the shock of the revelation lingering like an unspoken lesson for all who had witnessed it. But for Olivia, the fight wasn't over. She knew now, with absolute certainty, that she couldn't let this go unanswered. Not just for herself, not just for Ethan, for every family who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And she was just getting started. The weight of what had just happened settled over Olivia like a thick fog. Suffocating and unrelenting, she held Ethan tightly against her, feeling the rapid rise and fall of his small chest as he struggled to calm himself. He was exhausted, his little body tense from the stress, his mind still trapped in the whirlwind of confusion and anxiety that had been stirred up by the flight attendant's harsh treatment. Olivia wanted to cry, to scream, to demand that the world see her son for who he truly was, a kind, beautiful, innocent child who only needed understanding. But instead, she swallowed the lump in her throat and pressed a gentle kiss against Ethan's forehead. The plane continued its journey through the sky, but the air inside the cabin remained thick with tension. Even though the captain had stepped in, even though the truth had been revealed, Olivia could still feel the lingering weight of judgment from the flight attendants who had stood by and done nothing. The one who had berated her had disappeared to the front of the plane. But Olivia knew she was still there, likely reeling from the realization that she had just insulted the family that owned the very aircraft she worked on. And yet, that wasn't the part that upset Olivia the most. What truly infuriated her, what made her heart pound in her chest, was the fact that it shouldn't have mattered who they were. Ethan shouldn't have needed to be the son of someone wealthy to be treated with basic human decency. No child, no family, should have to endure the humiliation and cruelty that had been so carelessly thrown at them. And the worst part? This wasn't an isolated incident. Olivia knew this kind of thing happened every day. There were thousands, millions, of parents just like her, traveling with children on the autism spectrum, children with ADHD, sensory processing disorders, physical disabilities, or other challenges that made air travel uniquely difficult. And instead of being met with patience and understanding, they were met with sighs of frustration, sharp tones, and cold, judgmental stares. She had read about it. She had seen the horror stories online. Families being removed from flights because their autistic child had a meltdown. Parents being asked to control their children as if they were misbehaving instead of simply overwhelmed. Flight attendants treating neurodivergent passengers like they were problems instead of people. And now, she was living it. She inhaled slowly, trying to push down the fire burning inside her. This wasn't just about Ethan anymore. This was about every child who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. The flight continued in uneasy silence, but Olivia barely noticed the passing time. She was trapped in her own thoughts, replaying every moment of the confrontation, feeling the humiliation over and over again. She knew what needed to be done. She couldn't just let this go. Suddenly, a hesitant presence appeared beside her. It was a different flight attendant, an older woman with kind eyes that were clouded with nervousness. She cleared her throat gently before speaking. "Ma'am, I wanted to say I'm sorry." Her voice was softer than the last attendant's, laced with what sounded like genuine remorse. "I saw what happened earlier. And I need you to know that we're not all like that." Olivia looked up, searching the woman's face for any sign of insincerity. But there was none. "I appreciate you saying that," Olivia replied carefully. "But I hope you understand, an apology isn't enough." "Not anymore." The flight attendant nodded solemnly. "I know, and you're right." She hesitated before adding, "The truth is, we don't get training for this. I mean, they mention passengers with special needs in our courses. But it's so basic. We're taught how to handle emergency situations, unruly passengers, intoxicated travelers, but not this." She gestured subtly toward Ethan, who had finally started to calm down, resting his head against Olivia's chest. "No one teaches us how to recognize sensory overload. No one tells us what to do when a child with autism gets overwhelmed. We're not given the tools to help." Olivia clenched her jaw. That was exactly the problem. And she wasn't going to let it slide. By the time the plane landed, Olivia had made a decision, one that settled deep within her bones. She wasn't just going to send an email or make a single complaint. No, she was going to take this further. The next morning, after she and Ethan had settled back home, she wasted no time. She drafted an official complaint to the airline, outlining every detail of the incident, the flight attendant's rude behavior, the lack of training, the way her son had been traumatized simply for existing in a space that wasn't built for him. But she didn't stop there. She began reaching out to advocacy groups, organizations that focused on autism awareness and accessibility. She spoke with other parents who had similar experiences, collecting stories of discrimination, of families being mistreated on flights simply because their child had different needs. The more she learned, the more outraged she became. And then, she did something that made real waves. She used her family's influence. She reached out to people in the airline industry, CEOs, executives, people who could make real changes. And with each conversation, she made her case. Airlines were failing their most vulnerable passengers. They were unprepared, untrained, unequipped to handle neurodivergent travelers with respect and care. And it needed to change. She pushed for comprehensive training programs, not just a section in a manual. Not just a brief mention during onboarding, but real, hands-on training where flight attendants could learn to recognize sensory overload, understand how to de-escalate stressful situations, and, most importantly, treat neurodivergent passengers with compassion rather than frustration. The fight wasn't easy. She received pushback, dismissive responses, empty promises. But Olivia was relentless. She met with airline representatives, industry professionals, and disability advocates, refusing to let the issue be swept under the rug. She spoke at events, giving a voice to families like hers, telling the world that children like Ethan deserved to travel just like anyone else. And finally, after weeks of fighting, after pushing and demanding action, she won. The airline agreed to overhaul its training program. They implemented mandatory autism awareness courses for flight attendants and customer service representatives. They established protocols for accommodating passengers with sensory sensitivities, offering families the chance to inform staff of their needs before boarding. They created calm zones at airports, where overwhelmed passengers could regroup in a quiet, judgment-free space. For the first time, Olivia felt hope. It didn't erase what had happened on that flight. It didn't undo the pain of that moment. But it meant something bigger. It meant that no other family would have to experience what she and Ethan had endured. The world didn't change overnight. But she had started something. And that was worth everything. Olivia sat in the dim glow of her living room, her fingers gripping her phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The words of the flight attendant still echoed in her mind, sharp as a blade, cutting deeper every time she replayed them. "Control your child. You should have prepared better. That's not my problem." Her heart pounded with frustration, with exhaustion, with a fire that refused to die down. The memory of Ethan's tear-streaked face, the way his small body had trembled against hers, how his distress had been treated as an inconvenience instead of a cry for help, it fueled something in her. Something unstoppable. She couldn't let this go. This wasn't just about an apology. An apology wouldn't erase the damage, wouldn't take away the looks of judgment, the humiliation she had felt as the flight attendant dismissed her like she was nothing. This wasn't just about her. It was about every family that had been made to feel unwelcome. It was about every child who had been shamed for simply existing in a world that wasn't built for them. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and dialed the number for the airline's customer service. The line rang once, twice, then an automated voice filled her ear. "Thank you for calling Sky World Airlines. Please hold for the next available representative." Olivia's jaw tightened. She knew how this would go. She had dealt with companies before, scripted apologies, empty reassurances, promises that meant nothing, but she wasn't going to let them brush her off. Not this time. Finally, after several long minutes, a human voice replaced the robotic one. "Sky World Airlines customer support. This is Karen speaking. How may I assist you?" Olivia forced her voice to remain calm, steady, professional, because she knew if she let her anger take control, they'd dismiss her as just another hysterical mother. "Hello, Karen," she said, her voice deceptively soft. "I need to file a formal complaint regarding a flight I took yesterday. My son, who has autism, was mistreated by one of your flight attendants. I want to speak with someone in a position to address this, someone who can tell me what your airline is doing to ensure this never happens again." There was a pause, a hesitation. Olivia could hear the gears turning in the woman's mind, preparing the standard customer service response. "I'm very sorry to hear about your experience, ma'am," Karen said, her tone polite but distant. "We take all customer concerns very seriously. I can certainly file a report for you." "No," Olivia cut her off, her voice sharper now. "I don't want a report. I want action. I want answers. I want to know what steps Sky World Airlines is taking to train your employees in handling neurodivergent passengers. I want to know what changes will be made so that no other child has to go through what my son did." Karen hesitated again, this time longer. Olivia could tell she wasn't used to this, wasn't used to someone pushing past the protocol and scripted apologies. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration." "No, I don't think you do," Olivia snapped, "because if you did, I wouldn't have to fight for this conversation right now. If you understood, then my son wouldn't have been treated like a burden on that flight. If you understood, your airline would have already trained your staff properly. But you don't understand, and that's why I'm calling." Another long silence. Then, finally, Karen spoke again, her voice less mechanical this time. I need to escalate this to my supervisor." Olivia exhaled. Finally. "I'll hold." The minutes dragged on, but she didn't care. She would sit there all night if she had to. When the supervisor came on the line, Olivia went through it all, the lack of compassion, the blatant ignorance, the absolute failure of the airline to accommodate neurodivergent passengers. She detailed every word spoken by the flight attendant, every moment of humiliation, every second of Ethan's suffering. By the time she was finished, there was no doubt in the supervisor's voice. "We sincerely apologize for your experience, Mrs. Carter. I can assure you that we take this very seriously." "Then prove it," Olivia challenged. "I want to know what Sky World Airlines is doing about this. How will you make sure no other family has to endure this?" The supervisor hesitated but then said something Olivia hadn't expected. "We actually don't have a formal training program for autism awareness." Olivia's breath caught. There it was. The truth laid bare. They weren't prepared. They had never been prepared. And that was exactly why she had to keep fighting. "That needs to change," Olivia said, her voice resolute. "And I want to be part of making it happen." From that moment on, she made it her mission to ensure that Sky World Airlines, and every airline, understood the weight of what had happened. She wrote emails. She contacted advocacy groups. She reached out to other parents, gathering their stories, their experiences, their pain. She amplified their voices, refusing to let them be ignored. She spoke up, louder than she ever had before. Her story spread. Online forums picked it up. Autism advocacy organizations started reaching out, asking how they could help push for change. People began to listen. And when Sky World Airlines finally called her back, weeks later, she was ready. They wanted to discuss implementing mandatory autism awareness training for their employees. They wanted her input. She had done it. She had forced them to listen. And this was only the beginning. If Olivia's fight moved you, if you believe in her cause, if you stand for change, then show your support. Like this post, share it, and spread awareness, because no child, no family, should ever be treated like an inconvenience. Together, we can demand a world that understands. Together, we can make a difference. The email arrived late at night, long after Olivia had put Ethan to bed, after the exhaustion of another day spent fighting had settled deep into her bones. The subject line made her breath hitch. Sky World Airlines. Next steps in autism awareness training. She hesitated before opening it, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and skepticism. She had fought so hard to get here, to be heard. To make them see that this was more than just an isolated incident. That it was bigger than her. Bigger than Ethan. This was about every family who had ever been humiliated, dismissed, or made to feel like they didn't belong. The words on the screen blurred as she read through them, her hands trembling slightly. Dear Mrs. Carter, after careful review of your concerns and a thorough internal discussion, we acknowledge that our current training does not adequately prepare our staff to handle passengers with autism and sensory sensitivities. We deeply regret the experience you and your son had on Flight 276. And we are committed to making meaningful changes. We would like to invite you to collaborate with our team in developing a new autism awareness training program for our flight attendants, pilots, and customer service representatives. Your insights, as both a mother and an advocate, will be invaluable to ensuring that all passengers, regardless of their needs, feel safe and respected while flying with us. We look forward to your response. Sincerely, Adam Reese, Director of Customer Experience, Sky World Airlines. For a moment, Olivia just sat there, staring at the screen, her emotions tangled in a whirlwind. She had expected an apology, maybe even some vague promise of looking into the issue. But this was different. They weren't just apologizing, they were acknowledging their failure. And they were asking for her help to make it right. A lump formed in her throat as the weight of it all hit her. Every moment of frustration, every tear Ethan had shed, every judgmental stare, every condescending voice telling her to control her child. It hadn't been for nothing. This was a chance, a real chance, to create something that would impact not just her son, but countless others, to ensure that no other mother would have to sit in her seat, feeling powerless while the world turned against her child. She took a deep breath and pressed her fingers against the keyboard. Adam, thank you for reaching out. I appreciate the sincerity of your response and the steps Sky World Airlines is willing to take. I would be honored to work with your team to develop a training program that ensures flight attendants and crew members are equipped with the knowledge and empathy needed to serve neurodivergent passengers. However, I need to make something clear. This can't be just another corporate initiative that fades into the background. This has to be real. This has to create lasting change. I'd like to set up a meeting to discuss this in detail. Let me know when you're available. Best, Olivia Carter. She hit send, her pulse still racing. This was it, the beginning of something bigger. The meeting was set for the following week, and Olivia found herself standing in the sleek, modern headquarters of Sky World Airlines, feeling the weight of every parent who had ever fought for their child's dignity pressing against her shoulders. Across the conference table sat Adam Reese, the man who had sent the email. He was younger than she expected, maybe in his early 40s, with sharp eyes that seemed to genuinely listen when she spoke. Next to him was Sarah Mitchell, the airline's head of flight attendant training. Several others filled the seats, executives, HR specialists, even a few flight attendants who had volunteered to be part of the discussion. They were all here because of her, because she hadn't let them ignore her. She took a deep breath and began. First of all, I want to thank you for inviting me here, she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. But let's be clear, an apology isn't enough. Changing policy isn't enough. If we're going to do this, it has to be real. Adam nodded. That's exactly why you're here, Mrs. Carter. We know we need to do better, and we need guidance on how to actually make that happen. For the next 2 hours, they built the foundation of something that had never been done before. A mandatory autism awareness training program. Not a single-page memo. Not a quick, be more understanding, speech. A real, structured, hands-on program. A program that would teach flight attendants how to recognize the signs of sensory overload. A program that would train staff on how to de-escalate situations with compassion instead of impatience. A program that would give parents like her the chance to notify the airline ahead of time about their child's needs, so they weren't forced to explain mid-flight while their child was already overwhelmed. They discussed quiet zones in airports for children who needed a moment to regulate. They discussed a system where passengers with autism could pre-board, avoiding the chaos of crowded lines. They even discussed an emergency protocol for autistic passengers experiencing meltdowns, ensuring they were met with care, not hostility. By the end of the meeting, the exhaustion had settled deep into Olivia's bones, but so had something else. Hope. Real, tangible hope that the world might finally start to change. As she shook hands with Adam, he looked at her with something close to admiration. You fought hard for this, Olivia, he said, and I think this is just the beginning. She smiled, exhaustion and relief mixing together. You're right, she said, this is just the beginning. But what do you think? Should every airline implement an autism awareness program like this? Would you feel safer flying with a company that prioritized inclusion and understanding? Drop a comment below and tell us your thoughts. Because this isn't just Olivia's fight. The meeting at Skyworld Airlines had been a victory, one she had fought tooth and nail for, but Olivia knew, deep in her bones, that it wasn't enough. It wasn't just this airline that had failed her son. It was the entire system. A system that had never been designed with children like Ethan in mind. A system that left parents scrambling, trying to explain, justify, and defend their child's right to simply exist in public spaces without judgment. And that had to change. The night after her first official meeting with the airline, Olivia sat at her kitchen table, staring at the screen of her laptop. Ethan was asleep in the next room, his breathing soft and even, finally free from the weight of the world that had pressed down on him during that awful flight. But Olivia couldn't sleep, not yet. She pulled up a blank document and started typing. A letter, but not just to Skyworld Airlines. This letter would go to every major airline in the country. To their CEOs, their customer experience directors, their training departments. She would send it to policymakers who worked in disability rights, to advocacy groups who had been fighting this fight long before her, who could lend their voices to hers. Because she had realized something she should have seen from the beginning. This fight wasn't just hers. It belonged to every parent who had ever been forced off a plane because their autistic child was having a meltdown. It belonged to every adult on the spectrum who was treated with impatience instead of understanding. It belonged to every disabled traveler who had been humiliated for simply existing in a space that wasn't built for them. Olivia wasn't just fighting for Ethan anymore. She was fighting for all of them. The words poured out of her, raw and urgent. To whom it may concern. My name is Olivia Carter, and I am the mother of an autistic child. Recently, I was on a flight with my son when we experienced something that, unfortunately, is all too common for families like ours. A flight attendant, due to a lack of training and understanding, humiliated us in front of an entire plane of passengers simply because my son was overwhelmed. She did not try to understand. She did not try to help. She dismissed us as a problem, an inconvenience. But this letter is not just about my experience. This letter is about the thousands of families who have faced similar discrimination in air travel. It is about the parents who have been forced to carry the crushing weight of judgment, simply because their child reacts differently to the overwhelming world around them. It is about the autistic adults who have been treated with condescension, who have been told to behave or act normal instead of being met with compassion. It is about a system that has failed us, and it is time for that system to change. Skyworld Airlines has taken a step forward. They have agreed to implement mandatory autism awareness training for their flight attendants and customer service representatives. They are working with me and advocacy groups to create real policies that will ensure neurodivergent passengers are treated with dignity and respect. But one airline is not enough. This issue does not start and end with Skyworld. It is an industry-wide problem. So I am calling on you, on every airline that claims to care about its passengers, to step up and commit to the same. I am calling on you to implement mandatory autism awareness training for all flight attendants, pilots, and customer service representatives. Create a system that allows parents of neurodivergent children to notify the airline in advance, so flight crews are prepared to accommodate them. Establish quiet zones in airports for passengers with sensory sensitivities. Provide clear guidelines and de-escalation training for handling passengers who experience meltdowns, ensuring they are met with care, not hostility. This is not a small request, but it is a necessary one. Because every single day that passes without action, more families like mine are shamed, ignored, and made to feel unwelcome. And that is unacceptable. I look forward to your response and to seeing how your airline will be a part of the solution. Sincerely, Olivia Carter. She finished typing and sat back, her chest rising and falling with the weight of what she had just done. It was out of her hands now. Or at least, it would be soon. She sent the letter to every major airline CEO she could find. She sent it to disability rights organizations. She sent it to reporters who had covered accessibility issues in the past. And then, she waited. For a response. For pushback. For change. The first few days were quiet. Too quiet. But then, the emails started rolling in. Some were generic responses. Carefully worded corporate emails assuring her that they took her concerns seriously, but that they were already doing everything they could. Everything they could? That was a lie. Because if they had been doing everything they could, then families wouldn't be going through this every single day. So Olivia pushed harder. She sent follow-up emails. She called customer service lines and demanded to speak to someone higher up. She went to social media, posting her story in autism advocacy groups, in travel forums, in parenting communities. And that's when something incredible happened. Her post went viral. Parents began sharing their own horror stories. Families who had been kicked off flights because their child had been too loud. Autistic adults who had been mistreated by airport security. People who had avoided traveling altogether because they knew they wouldn't be accommodated. News outlets started reaching out for interviews. Olivia's story wasn't just a story anymore. It was a movement. She was flooded with messages, some from parents thanking her for speaking up, others from advocacy groups wanting to help, and then, the one she had been waiting for. An email from another major airline executive. A simple subject line. "We'd like to talk." Olivia stared at it, her heart pounding. Because this was change in motion. She had forced them to listen. And she wasn't stopping now. Do you believe airlines should implement autism awareness training? Have you or someone you know ever struggled with accessibility while traveling? Comment below and share your thoughts. Because Olivia isn't fighting this battle alone. She's fighting for all of us. And together, we can change the world. The weight of change doesn't settle all at once. It builds, it shifts, it starts as a whisper. Then a conversation, then a movement that refuses to be ignored. For Olivia Carter, that change had started in a place of pain, a moment of humiliation on a plane where her son, Ethan, had been treated like a burden instead of a child, where she had been met with judgment instead of kindness, dismissal instead of understanding. But now, it was different. Now, people were listening. The days after her viral post had been a whirlwind of interviews, meetings, and difficult conversations. Skyworld Airlines had stepped up, agreeing to implement new autism awareness training. But Olivia knew that true progress wouldn't happen overnight. It wasn't just about one airline. It was about every airline, every airport, every flight attendant, every security checkpoint where a neurodivergent traveler might be misunderstood, mistreated, or ignored. And she wasn't going to let that happen. The first steps toward change. The first time Olivia walked into the Skyworld Airlines training facility, she felt the weight of every moment of frustration she had ever experienced pressing down on her. She wasn't here to simply talk about the changes needed. She was here to shape them. A room full of flight attendants, customer service representatives, and airline executives sat before her, notebooks open, waiting. Some looked skeptical, some looked curious, and some, the ones who truly wanted to learn, looked eager. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "My name is Olivia Carter, and I am the mother of an autistic child. I am here because a flight attendant humiliated my son, because she saw him struggling, and instead of helping, she saw him as a problem." The room was silent. "But I am also here because I believe you can do better. Because I believe you want to do better." She could see it in their faces, the understanding that this wasn't just another corporate seminar, another check-the-box diversity training. This was real life. For the next 4 hours, Olivia and a team of autism advocates walked them through what it meant to travel as a neurodivergent person. They talked about sensory overload, how the bright lights, loud announcements, and unpredictable movement of air travel could overwhelm someone like Ethan. They talked about meltdowns versus tantrums, how a meltdown wasn't a child acting out, but rather a physiological response to overstimulation. They role-played scenarios, putting the flight attendants in realistic situations where they had to respond with compassion and patience rather than frustration. And they answered questions, So many questions. What do we do if a child starts screaming? How can we de-escalate a situation if a passenger is struggling? How do we support parents without making them feel like they're failing? By the time the training was over, something had shifted. Some of the flight attendants came up to her, their eyes filled with something Olivia hadn't seen before in this industry. Understanding. We never knew, one woman said, shaking her head. I wish I had known this years ago. I've probably handled situations like this all wrong in the past. Olivia smiled, exhaustion blurring into satisfaction. Well, now you do, she said, and you have the power to make someone else's flight easier. The first signs of progress. Weeks later, Olivia's phone buzzed with an email that made her heart race. Subject: Passenger feedback, autism awareness training in action. She opened it and felt tears sting her eyes. Asterisk, Dear Olivia, I wanted to personally reach out and share a story that happened last week on one of our flights. A family was traveling with their autistic son, who was struggling with sensory overload during boarding. Instead of the usual tension and frustration, our flight attendants immediately recognized what was happening. They gave the family extra time to settle in. They provided the child with noise-canceling headphones from our new sensory kit. They reassured the parents that they were welcome, that they were safe here. And the mother, we could tell she was bracing for a fight, ready to defend her child. But when she realized she didn't have to, when she saw that our crew actually understood, she started crying. She told us, "This has never happened before. We always expect judgment, but today, we felt seen. I just wanted you to know that this happened because of you. Because you fought for this change. And now, it's making a difference." Adam Reese, Director of Customer Experience, Skyworld Airlines. Olivia clutched her phone to her chest, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was working. Her fight, the endless emails, the social media storm, the meetings, the exhaustion, it was worth it. Because one more family had been spared the pain she had felt that day on her flight with Ethan. Other airlines follow suit. The momentum didn't stop there. As word spread about Skyworld's new policies, other airlines started taking notice. First, a small regional airline reached out, wanting to implement a similar program. Then, one of the largest airlines in the country announced a new initiative, creating sensory-friendly airport lounges, complete with dim lighting, weighted blankets, and quiet zones where passengers with sensory sensitivities could regroup before their flights. One by one, the industry began to shift. But Olivia knew, it still wasn't enough. A bigger fight, government policies and global standards. Airlines were changing voluntarily, but there was still no law requiring them to accommodate autistic passengers. And Olivia couldn't stop until there was. She began working with disability rights groups, pushing for legislation that would require airlines to provide autism training and accommodations, not as a favor, not as an option, but as a legal standard. She testified at hearings. She spoke at conferences. She sat at tables with lawmakers, CEOs, and advocacy leaders, using her voice to demand lasting change. And then, 1 year after that fateful flight with Ethan, she got the call. A federal bill was being drafted. A bill that would require all airlines to offer sensory accommodations. A bill that would make autism training mandatory for all airline employees. A bill that would make air travel accessible for everyone. As Olivia hung up the phone, she turned to look at Ethan, who was sitting on the floor, lining up his favorite toy cars in a perfect row, his little fingers tapping gently as he played. She walked over, knelt beside him, and kissed the top of his head. "We did it, buddy," she whispered. "We really did it." And for the first time since that terrible flight, she felt at peace. Do you believe every airline should have mandatory autism training? Should airports have quiet zones for sensory-sensitive passengers? Comment below with your thoughts. And let's keep fighting for a world where no one has to feel unwelcome just for being different. Because together, we can make air travel safer, kinder, and more inclusive for everyone. The world doesn't change in a day. It takes a voice, a relentless fight, and a community willing to stand together. Olivia Carter had never set out to start a movement. She had only wanted a little compassion, a moment of patience. A flight crew that understood that her son, Ethan, wasn't being difficult, wasn't misbehaving, wasn't a problem to be solved. She had wanted what every parent of a child with special needs wanted, to be seen, to be understood, to be welcomed instead of judged. But her battle had become so much more than a single flight. a single airline, or even a single industry. She had challenged the system. And she had won battles that no one thought possible. And now? Now, the world was listening. A moment that changed everything. The invitation arrived unexpectedly, tucked between advocacy emails and legislative updates. Skyworld Airlines cordially invites Olivia Carter to attend the Aviation Accessibility Awards, where she will be recognized for her contributions to disability inclusion in air travel. She had to read the email 3 times before she truly understood what it was saying. An award, a moment of public recognition for a fight she had never intended to wage, but had refused to back down from. For a moment, she sat there in silence, staring at the words. The award wasn't the victory. The real victory was the policies that were changing. The families who no longer had to fear boarding a plane with their autistic child. The airports that were building sensory-friendly spaces. But this was proof. Proof that one voice could shake the world. Proof that a mother's love could move mountains. The ceremony, a standing ovation for change. The ballroom was massive, lined with elegant tables and glittering chandeliers. The air buzzed with conversation, with laughter, with the polished hum of corporate executives mingling with disability advocates. Olivia sat near the front, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't used to this, the spotlight, the attention, but she wasn't here for herself. She was here for Ethan. For every mother who had ever fought to be heard. For every child who had ever been dismissed as a burden. When her name was called, the room erupted into applause. She hadn't expected that. The sound of it, people rising to their feet, clapping, celebrating her fight. It sent a lump rising in her throat. Tears threatening to spill. She walked to the stage slowly, taking in the moment, the weight of everything she had been through settling on her shoulders. The award was placed in her hands, a sleek, engraved plaque recognizing her unwavering dedication to disability inclusion in air travel. She looked out at the crowd. CEOs, advocates, flight attendants who had taken her training and changed the way they approached their jobs. Parents who had flown without fear for the first time because of what she had done. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and spoke. This isn't about me. The room fell silent. This is about the mother who still hesitates before booking a flight because she's afraid of how her child will be treated. This is about the father who dreads the whispers and glares from passengers when his autistic son needs to stim to stay calm. This is about every child, every adult, every human being who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. Her voice trembled, but she kept going. I accept this award not as a symbol of accomplishment, but as a reminder that we still have work to do. Because no parent should have to fight this hard to make the world kinder to their child. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. And so, I challenge every airline in this room, every business leader, every policymaker, keep pushing, keep changing, because inclusion is not a favor. It is a right. The applause this time? It was deafening. And for the first time, Olivia believed it. Beyond the airlines, a global movement begins. The policies Olivia had fought for didn't just stay within Skyworld Airlines. Soon, other airlines followed, then airports, then entire countries began discussing legislation that would make accessibility in air travel a legal requirement. It wasn't just about autism anymore. It was about universal inclusion, wheelchair accessibility, visual and hearing impairments, service animal accommodations. Airlines were forced to rethink everything. The ripple effect was undeniable. And it had started with one mother, one flight, one refusal to stay silent. Lessons we can all learn from Olivia's story. Olivia's journey wasn't just about airlines. It was about life. It was about the power of speaking up, the importance of never backing down, and the undeniable force of love when it's fighting for what's right. And maybe that's the lesson we all need to take with us. If you see injustice, speak up. Whether it's a child being mistreated, a coworker being ignored, or a system that is broken, your voice matters. Kindness should not be a luxury. The way we treat people who experience the world differently than us says everything about who we are. Change takes time, but it starts with one person. Olivia was just one mother on one flight, but look what she did. Imagine what we could do if we all stood up for what's right. The fight for inclusion never ends. Whether in schools, workplaces, public transportation, or beyond, we must always push for better. And most importantly, 5. Never underestimate the power of love. A mother's love for her child changed an entire industry. Love is powerful. Love is unstoppable. Love can reshape the world.